My dissertation is named Recycle, about sustainability in glass craft and design. And I would like to say thank you to the opponents for their constructive feedback prior to this event. I shall attempt to address your comments during the presentation. The physical results of the research is presented over here for your convenience, and you're welcome to take a look at it after. My presentation consists of 3 sections. The first section includes the introduction of the project and a problem formulation, an overview of the theoretical foundation, and an overview of the methods and experimental approach that I've used. The second section includes a review of the experiments produced during the research and their results in relation to the theoretical foundation. The third section includes a summary of the conclusions and the contributions I propose in the dissertation. And to start with the statistics. Glass is a natural material. It's 100% recyclable without loss of material qualities. 1 ton of carbon dioxide is reduced for every 6 tons of recycled container glass used in the manufacturing processes. And for each ton of shards recycled, more than 1 ton of virgin materials are replaced. Unfortunately, most glass designers and crafts professionals do not use recycled glass as their main material. Today, most professionals in Europe are using a modern crystal, is what it's called. Lead crystal is not being used anymore. It's prohibited in most of Europe, but our modern crystals are very popular due to their material qualities. Container glass is the largest fraction of glass in circulation. We use more container glass than window glass and other types of glass. Denmark is currently recycling 85% of the container glass that's in circulation. That's quite good. Belgium is a little better. They recycle 95%. The English are terrible, and the Americans are even worse. When the glass is not recycled, it ends up in landfills, as the one you can see here from Cheyenne, Wyoming. So why don't we use this glass? There's a reluctance amongst my peers towards using waste container glass. The qualities of a material are not as seductive as crystal that is more popular in the field. There's a widespread assumption that recycled container glass will dictate the aesthetic outcomes and result in a green aesthetic, as demonstrated in these glasses. And the dissertation is challenging this assumption. My thesis is that sustainable principles can support aesthetic autonomy and innovation, which led me to the following problem formulation. In what way, if any, can principles of sustainability inform creative processes and contribute to generation of aesthetic innovation within glass craft and design? And, on the other hand, how can the field of glass craft and design contribute to sustainable development? I have chosen a relatively broad foundation for my investigation centered around sustainability, rather than taking a narrow focus on glass due to the nature of the subject matter. The first official definition of sustainability came with the Brundtland Report in 1987, and since then sustainability has become more mainstream. In 2010, for instance, the report Towards a Circular Economy was released by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and the UN Global Compact book was released on the political front. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a corporate foundation. And with sustainability at the core of the research, I built the theoretical foundations on resources and that intersects with glass, design, craft, aesthetics, and innovation. So with regard to design and sustainability, there's quite a lot of material available in the academic realm. Most of you probably have heard of Cradle to Cradle. It's Braungart and McDonald that contributed to making sustainability sort of mainstream in the design field. Common to Cradle and Bruce Mau is that they are trying to connect the theoretical parts to the practical parts, which is also what I'm interested in. But I've also read some of the other big guys in glass and sustainability that have a more theoretical focus. With regards to glass and sustainability, I was able to locate two recent PhDs that were working with glass and sustainability particularly. Oh Seng has written her thesis about recycling flat glass for use in architectural projects, and Siikamäki has written about how to recycle TV screens. They have a little bit of a different approach. They go into depth about their particular interest, where my research has been more broad. I've also been looking into design and glass and craft that didn't have to do with sustainability in order to begin to build more understanding about why it is that sustainability is more has been adapted more in certain areas than in other areas. I've been able to locate Hursti, who's been writing about pressing glass, which I had a particular interest in because I'm also using that technique. With regards to craft and sustainability, there's a recent book by Harper, came out in 2015. She is writing about the intersection between craft and sustainability. And her take is to begin to analyze how those two things relate to each other. With regards to aesthetics and sustainability, there's Skriver, who has written a book about sustainable aesthetics, which is pretty much the opposite of what I would like to prove. And with regards to aesthetics, I've also gone into both the very old guys like Kant and also more recent research from Graham and Sangwell. On the innovation and sustainability side, there's so much information that I just had to sort of more or less cut it out because none of it really related very much to glass and craft and design. Most of it is written from an economical point of view and didn't have particular relevance to my research. Yes. So I hope this has adequately addressed the first two comments from the opponents. The dissertation, does not position itself clearly in the larger landscape of practice-based art and design research within craft and glass craft and design. And this could have been done through more reference to other PhDs in glass and craft. And also, it has a relatively broad and distanced discussion of the academic literature referenced. Again, a closer focus on practice-based research in glass would have helped position the research better. Yes. as part of my theoretical foundation, I have developed a classification system to enable a more detailed understanding of the realm of aesthetics and separate the discussion of aesthetics from the discussion of taste. By comparing the study of aesthetics to the study of ethic layers of the realm of to the study of ethics, layers of the realms of aesthetics can be identified. So in ethic theory, we normally talk about the meta level and the normative level and the applied level to begin to understand when we're dealing with different aspects of ethics. And I tried to transfer that to how we discuss aesthetics. And here I'm particularly interested in the correspondence between intended aesthetics and perceived aesthetics that offers and the perceived aesthetics are very often discussed by Kant and Samuel, for instance, and I think it's significant for most theoreticians that they are thinking of aesthetics as something that we look at mainly, and they discuss taste a lot in that connection. Whereas as artistic practitioners, we deal more with envisioned aesthetics because we create new aesthetics. So I was trying to use this relation between perceived aesthetics and intended aesthetics to set up a framework for assessment of the aesthetic outcomes of the experiments that I did with the focus on innovation. Yes, I've chosen a practice-based research method, and in my interpretation, this consists of 3 different aspects. Of course, it's a scientific PhD that I've written, and I have to meet the requirements of that format. But that being said, I think it's important to distinguish between the artistic part of the research, the scientific part of the research, and the professional practice part of the research. Some scholars would argue that artistic research and scientific research is similar, and it can be in some areas, I agree. But where they differ is in their aims, and where professional practice, you know, will generate new craft and design. Scientific research, the aim of that is to generate new knowledge, and that cannot be discussed. Whereas artistic research is about generating new artistic insight or aesthetic spaces of opportunity. So possibilities for generating new artistic insight. And sometimes artistic research does not have an aim at all. And sometimes it can generate knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily have to, in my opinion. My experiments will shed a little bit more light on what I mean about that. In addition to the practice-based research method, I've used triangulation. This concept has derived from the social sciences and is used to tackle qualitative research. Quantitative research is easy to deal with because you have the numbers to support your assumptions, but in qualitative research it can be more difficult to build a viable argumentation. So triangulation means to look at the subject matter from several different viewpoints to build a viable argument rather than a one-sided account. In this research, the theoretical perspective covers the landscape of the subject matter, and the practice-based method perspective connect practice to theory, which I find very important. My experimental approach is used for seeking aesthetic innovation, and the education-based research perspective involves my students and my colleagues. I've also included elements of action research involving users and engaging the audience through interventions. And by involving others in my research, I also avoid getting aesthetic outcomes that only reflect my own aesthetic preferences. There's been two categories of experiments, or two different takes on the experiments. One is going from introducing sustainability in my craft practice, and the other is about how glass craft and design can contribute to sustainable innovation. With regard to how the sustainable principles influence glass craft and design, the experiments have been conducted to support the assumption that sustainable principles in the creative process would allow for aesthetic innovation rather than dictate a narrow, specific aesthetic. And they've been conducted to establish a foundation for experimenting in recycled soda-lime glass, to gain knowledge of the inherent aesthetic qualities of the material, and to gain knowledge of how the material responds to a range of different techniques. With regard to the influence of glass craft and design on sustainability, the experiments have been conducted to gain knowledge about how glass craft and design may contribute to sustainable development. In the next section, I will talk about my experiments, and while I do that, I shall attempt to meet the opponent's next two questions or comments. It is relatively vague on explicating what is the knowledge contribution of the research work. What specific new knowledge is now available for glass practitioners, and on how this knowledge contribution stems from a particular experimental design practice. Yes. So, the experiments that I've done include personal experiments, student workshops, students' experiments, professionals' experiments, experiments with intervention, and experiments with user participation. And my principle for analysis has been to look at why I did the experiment in the first place, what the experiment entails and how I did it, and what the outcome was, and the knowledge and insight it produced. The first experiments I started doing was with the pressing technique. The purpose of this experiment was to enable experimentation with pressing and accommodate the qualities of the material. The pressing technique involves, of course, something to press the glass into. And in traditional industrial design, we use metal molds. The metal molds are extremely expensive, which means that it's very, it obstructs the possibility for experimenting, because it's simply too expensive to buy a mold for 5,000 crowns. You don't do that to do an experiment. So in order for the students to actually be able to experiment in pressing, we had to come up with alternative solutions to how to do that. Of course, we can press in sand, and we can press in different types of molds, but to get more precision, it's nice to have some pretty stable material. So I talked to our workshop leader at the Superform Lab, and he suggested we try a high temperature castable, which we did, and it turned out to work quite well. So that was great. We had an opening. That was the first successful experiment that enabled experimentation further with this technique. So that's a contribution. And then we, of course, use this technique to do different kinds of experiments. And personally, I did an experiment to explore aesthetic issues of classic, sharp, symmetrical, and functional. It was important for me to generate a range of different objects that express different aesthetic value in order to make it viable that innovation is actually possible even with this material. It was also a technical exploration of old and new technology. I worked with computer renderings of a design printed in plastic that I took concrete molds off of and then pressed the glass into the concrete. So in that process, I developed technical knowledge of how the high temperature castable worked together with the glass. And in this particular experiment, the envisioned aesthetics corresponded with the perceived aesthetics. So what I had envisioned when I started out actually matched with what came out. And but that didn't necessarily mean that it was a particularly innovative product. It looks rather classic, like something we've seen before. While we were at it with the pressing technique, we pulled out the sandbox, my colleague Anders and I, and did some experiments with pressing into sand. And in this particular experiment, I didn't have any perceived aesthetic or intended aesthetics when I started out. I just went at it and saw what came out of it. I learned a lot about the material and how it reacts to the pressing, and because with the press machine, there's an arm in between myself and the material, so there I learned about how it responds to the pressure of my arm through the metal arm and into the concrete and into the glass, whereas when I press in the sand, it's a lot more direct. I have a little hand tool, drop the glass in the sand, and then I push it around, so I get a closer relationship with the glass and the tool than I do in the pressing machine. So all of these experiments generate a layer of tacit knowledge in my body that I can not write in my dissertation, but that I carry with me. The result of this experiment I thought was more innovative than the classical bows, and I had a colleague from the brand Holmegaard come in and look at my work, and he was also particularly interested in this experiment. I did experiments with blowing because there's another assumption in my field that blowing in recycled container glass is really difficult, and the glass is very short and you have no time to work on it. And I wished to challenge this assumption as well. And I started blowing the glass together with a group of students in Bornholm. And we found out that it was actually not as complicated as we had first envisioned or imagined. So this assumption has also been challenged by the research. You can actually blow this material and it's not that big of a deal. And of course we also developed knowledge about retention of heat, reheating capacity, viscosity, clarity, quality of the material, colors, textures, and so on. in the actual work with the material in the workshop. In my artistic work, I also very often use fusing, and therefore I decided to do experiments with fusing as well. Here I was exploring patterns, and again, my envisioned aesthetics did not match the perceived aesthetics afterwards. I found out that the material devitrifies quite aggressively. Devitrification is a process where the glass turns into clay. It becomes crystalline, whereas normally glass is amorphous. And this particular type of glass does that very quickly. So I was quite surprised to see when I did the first fusing experiments that they just got white all over. That was a surprise, but it was one of the happy surprises that I think can open up for further exploration and generate innovation. Hot formed objects or hot sculpting is another technique that I am using in my artistic work, and needed to find out how it worked in relation to this material. And in this case, the intended and or the envisioned and the perceived aesthetics were corresponding, and I've got the objects that I needed. Another experiment was to see if the sustainable principles could be used to generate the tool itself. And in this experiment, I dug scraps out of the metal workshops and created a casting tool that I could then use to produce a multiple different geometries, where each geometry would be different. So the sustainability actually, or the ideas of using a sustainable approach generated a concept where I could produce one-offs just by changing the tool each time I took a new print or a new cast. And the last experiment was with traditional casting. I was exploring aesthetic issues of sharp, geometrical, and composition. And in this particular experiment, everything went wrong. And the first plaster molds went well, but then I went up in size, and my plaster mold broke while I was filling it up with glass, and the glass started running out, so I had to quickly stop the process and open the door, let out the heat, so that I wouldn't destroy the kiln. And the result of this experiment was that the intended and perceived aesthetics did not match at all, but instead aesthetic innovation was actually produced. And artistic insight about openness to troublesome or unsuccessful experiments was the result of this experiment. So it's rather aggressive and not so geometrical and sharp as I had intended. In my student workshops, I was trying to disseminate the knowledge that I created during my own experiment, and transfer some of the knowledge to the students. I was testing techniques and developing techniques together with the students, and we were also testing testing the combination of new and old technology, as in the experiments that you see at the bottom with Flemming Tvede Hansen, who had a group of students create 3D geometries in the computer, and then we transferred them to both glass and ceramics. Yes. The dissemination of knowledge was successful, I believe. We have some of my students here in the room today. They can testify. The technical tests were successful, some of them, and some of them were not, and that, of course, goes to generate a basis for further experimentation so that we can get further. So I'm laying down a foundation here rather than seeking excellence in one area. And I think also quite a few of the experiments showed opportunity for aesthetic innovation. Some of my students and some of my colleagues also took up the ideas that I was developing and used them for their own products. We have tiles by Peter Moel-Daman and plates by Yara Rabinovic and a lampfoot by Lars Tingsgaard Mikkelsen. And then I had the experiments with interventions and user participation. And this was also to test how envisioned aesthetics were perceived by others, and dissemination of artistic ideas, and to generate diversity of aesthetic expressions. I was casting and decorating glass cubes and taking them out into the public realm. And I can certainly say that the envisioned and perceived aesthetics did not correspond. I thought I was doing something that was a little rough with cobblestones that are sometimes used as weapons for street fights and stuff like that. And the people that saw it out there, they thought it was cute and sweet. And yeah, so that just goes to tell how much self-reflection we have. But of course I thought a lot about that afterwards. Yes, so now I'll get to the last section, which is the conclusions and the contributions to the practice. So as you may have remembered, I have this idea of practice-based research consisting of the professional practice, the artistic research, and the scientific research. So I've divided my contributions into those three sections, and then on the other hand, I've divided them into how sustainability can contribute to the practice and how the practice can contribute to sustainability. So on the contributions to practice, I have on the aesthetic innovation side, tacit and explicit knowledge of the aesthetic opportunities of recycled soda lime glass. Aesthetics explored in the experiments include, for instance, classic, post-minimalist, deconstructivist, and then what I've called user participationist and interventionist aesthetics. I've worked with geometric as well as organic forms, functional and decorative forms, and I've explored colors, textures, opacity, translucency, and transparency. And with regard to sustainable innovation, tacit and explicit knowledge of the materials, techniques, and technologies have been developed, and they can be used for incremental change through practice, through teaching, and through engaging users. With regards to contributions to scientific knowledge, on the aesthetic innovation side, I've developed aesthetic theory. I've developed a classification system for understanding the realms of aesthetic in a more detailed way. And with regards to creative methodology, I've contributed to the understanding of the complexity of research that includes involvement in artistic practices. With regards to sustainable innovation, I've generated knowledge about sustainability in glass, craft and design, and systematic documentation and dissemination of information in the book. And also I've worked on a methodology for a research practice within glass craft and design by building a foundation for systematic use of sustainable principles in the creative processes and analysis within a practice-based research framework. And the contributions to artistic insight includes, on the aesthetic innovation side, knowledge and insight about aesthetic opportunities of recycled soda lime glass, as well as philosophical aspects of aesthetics and methodologies. On the meta-aesthetic level, insight about how we create, perceive, and evaluate aesthetic innovation. And with regards to sustainable innovation, I've generated insight about sense and nonsense of sustainability in glass, craft, and design. On the sense side, aesthetic diversity that you can see here. Embracing and not dictated by sustainability. And on the nonsense side, aesthetic innovation can happen accidentally. The openness to the value of accidental outcomes is a contribution to sustainable development along the line of acknowledging trash as a resource. In conclusion, to the first question, in what way, if any, can principles of sustainability inform creative processes and contribute to generation of aesthetic innovation within glass, craft, and design? We can say that principles of sustainability can act as deliberately generated obstacles in the creative process, causing aesthetic innovation. They can act as catalysts for change that will generate more change, and they can inform creative processes with innovation as a result. But it is not a direct cause and effect relationship. And how can the field of glass, craft, and design contribute to sustainable development? And I say that we can do that as as a glass craft professional and as a designer. I can contribute by changing my existing habitual practice and by encouraging others to do the same on the basis of this thesis. That was the last question and its answer. Thank you.